Hello, and welcome to Mr. Andosha's sociology class. You've all signed up to learn sociology, or you searched the web and clicked on this link. Now you need to know why. What the heck is sociology? What makes sociology different from, say, psychology or history? Well, I hope to answer that question in this lecture. You can take notes using the attached self-guided notes, you can ask questions, and offer comments in the comments section. Look, sociology is a challenging discipline because it requires us to take a long, hard look at some of our most cherished beliefs about the world we live in, about our society, our culture, and about ourselves, and subject them to scientific scrutiny. Often the student of sociology is confronted with the conflict involved in learning social facts which contradict his or her most ardent beliefs. The student must then decide whether to accept the data, which may require realigning her beliefs, or stick to her beliefs, which means rejecting the data, in which case you're not doing sociology. So sociology is not for the weak-willed. If you're not willing to flat out confront some of the things that you hold dear, then you're probably not going to do well as a sociologist. So what is sociology? One of my professors suggested that sociology seeks to find the amazing in the mundane and the mundane in the amazing. Think about something as simple as your classroom. Pretty mundane, right? Especially if you had my 9th grade geometry teacher, Mr. Murphy. Then you know from mundane. But is it as mundane as you think? Think about it. You're sitting in a classroom learning sociology in much the same way that millions of other students all over the world are sitting in classrooms learning their particular fields. You're also learning other things like self-discipline, like the acceptance of authority, like how to shape your behaviors to conform to social expectations, when what you'd really rather do is walk out of the room, head down to the beach, and hang out in the sun with some of your friends. But no, you're here with me, learning sociology. Thanks for that. And ultimately, your experiences in this class are actually shaping you as a scholar, a citizen, a human being, who's able to interact with millions of other human beings with more or less ease. And you in turn may use these skills to contribute to and advance the discipline of sociology or mathematics or science or whatever discipline that you're involved in. So you may end up contributing, and then the contributions that you make may actually end up being incorporated into a classroom where other young people are going to be sitting in the same seats that you're sitting in today and advancing the field in their own way. So we're talking about millions of reproductions here. Holy cow, that's actually pretty amazing when you really stop and think about it. Or take something truly amazing, like an astronaut. How can you make something like going to space mundane? Well, fear not, the sociologist can do it. The sociologist may look at an astronaut as a worker doing any other job, just like any other person going to work every day. Indeed, going into space is often a small part of an astronaut's actual job description. Most astronauts actually hold other jobs, like scientists or engineers, which takes up most of their time. Then they apply for positions in which they do their jobs in space. Astronaut Charlie Camarda states, "It is not all glory, games, fun, and adventure. When you are first selected, you get to tour the country and visit all the NASA sites and get to bond as a class and future team. You're in the limelight and are treated like royalty for a brief period of time. And then the real world kicks in and you start training, survival, water, land, winter, you name it, shuttle systems, space station systems, Russian segment systems, expedition, rendezvous and docking, extravehicular activity, in other words, spacewalk, robotic arm, etc. Being an astronaut can be examined in exactly the same way that one might examine being an accountant." Wow, thanks for that. So what is sociology? Sociology is the systematic study of human interaction within a social context. Sounds simple enough. So what? So what? Everything you do, everything you are, is something that takes place within society, what I call a social matrix. Everything from what it means to be an adult, a man or woman, successful and not successful, everything that you have ever learned has been taught through some kind of social mechanism. Family, peers, schools, work. Your hopes and dreams for your future depend on the stability and freedom accorded to you by your society to make those hopes and dreams come true. So understanding society from the perspective of sociology is an attempt to understand yourself from your predecessors, your earliest experiences, your status as it is today, and your prospects for the future. It's all sociology. The great American sociologist C. Wright Mills, in his book The Sociological Imagination, once said that neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. Take a look at your classroom again. Look around at all the faces. If you're in a typical high school or college classroom, you should see a bunch of young men and women representing a plethora of different ethnicities, races, maybe from different social backgrounds. Many college classes will include people of different ages. Yet just a few generations ago, your classrooms would have looked very different. Your high school classes would have been more homogeneous. Maybe boys and girls would be sitting together, but they would almost certainly be either all white or all black. Often of similar social backgrounds. College classrooms would have been predominantly young white men. What happened? Did minorities and women just become smarter in the last few years? Of course not. Social opportunities expanded, making greater diversity possible, opening doors to more and more members of society. This wasn't an accident. This involved thousands of people questioning what their society had established as right for people of color and for women, and challenging their societies to change. When they won, society had to implement rules and norms to handle new realities, and the work is not yet complete. Look around again and try to expand your minds even further. Are the people sitting in your class right now representative of the larger community? Are about half of your classmates young women, for instance? If not, then there's something going on. What? Is the composition of your classroom the result of greater opportunity or restrictions on opportunity? How do we know? How do we examine these things in such a way that we can optimize human potential for everyone? So yeah, sociology is kind of important. Now, one of the complications of sociology as an academic discipline is that when you really stop and think about it, when you really take an amazing topic like sociology and try to see the mundane, you realize that everyone is, to a certain extent, a sociologist. We all must navigate society successfully. This becomes apparent when we find ourselves in new social arrangements. Are you a high school or college freshman, for instance? If you are, then your sociological imagination is peaked right now. You are busy examining and analyzing your surrounding acutely in order to learn the rules of engagement, how to interact, how to dress, where to sit, how to speak, everything. And you will shape who you are in order to fit into this new world. But it won't be long before you become an expert in this new world and you're able to get through your everyday life without even thinking about it. People who haven't seen you in a while will comment on how much you've changed, how you've grown up, but you'll see yourself as much the same as you've always been. What? I'm me. I haven't changed a bit. But you're wrong, and they're right. You have changed yourself to meet your new social demands based on your sociological observations. So you too are a sociologist. So to a certain extent, we all have a sociological imagination, as Mills defined it. What we don't typically do is subject society to a systematic analysis. We're just trying to get through class without embarrassing ourselves too much. The sociologist, however, is tasked with taking the everyday lived experience and breaking it down to its bare components, subjecting them to analysis and drawing scientifically valid and reliable conclusions. That's a little deeper than just trying to figure out the best way to ask Melissa Finley out for pizza. Just ask. What do you have to lose? Sometimes, too, sociology gets confused with social commentary. There are also an awful lot of people out there who offer their own analysis of society as social commentary based on their experiences, observations, and what we refer to as common sense notions. This is not to be confused with sociology. Unless they've subjected their experiences and observations to sociological analysis. In other words, they're grounding what they observe in sociological theory that is supported by valid and reliable data. That's the difference between sociology and social commentary. Now, you can use sociology for social commentary, but you can't confuse social commentary for sociology. For instance, many people have observed that video games are more violent than ever before. It seems common sense that if kids are exposed to this kind of violence, then there's a danger that they themselves may become more violent in real lives. So there's a real fear that young people are becoming more violent today. It's easy to confirm this by looking at the evening news and seeing examples of violent teens and shootings. Yet, this observation and analysis is not supported by the data. If the observation were true that violent video games are causing teenagers to become more violent than they were before, then I should be able to predict that violent crime rates among young people has increased as video games have become more realistically violent. Yet this is not what we see. In fact, we see the opposite. Violent crime rates among young people has decreased. You may not like violent video games. You may believe they're unhealthy, and you may even be right. But this particular analysis is clearly not valid. It is incumbent upon the sociologist to make sure that he or she is not just accepting what appears on the surface to be a common sense notion. In other words, a common sense notion is a notion that everyone accepts as true without question. This often leads us to false assumptions. When the sociologist is looking at a particular phenomenon, we're asking some key questions intent on leading us to a greater understanding of how this particular thing of interest, say violence, is influenced by larger social structures. This distinguishes us from the psychologists, for instance, who focus on mental variables involved. A psychologist might ask how violent video games shapes one's psychological stability. But the sociologist would point out that psychological stability is often defined in how one interacts with others. It's a sociological variable. Sociological states that may be adaptive in one setting may be maladaptive in another setting. The anthropologist might examine cultural elements of gaming as it relates to violent video games. But again, the sociologist would point out that the institutional structures that are required for gaming must be in place in order for this to even exist. A biologist or neurologist might be interested in how violent video games stimulate parts of the brain. But brain processes matter most when they're translated into social actions and interactions. This doesn't disqualify what psychologists and anthropologists and neurologists have to say. Indeed, their contributions are very important, and sociologists should not hesitate to take conclusions from other fields and incorporate them into our analysis. Sidebar here, sociologists are not immune to certain social and academic idiocies, like compartmentalization, the belief that our particular discipline is the most important discipline and takes precedence over all other disciplines like psychology or philosophy or history or neurology. Just saying. When a sociologist looks at a particular phenomenon, we're asking certain questions distinct from what may be asked in other disciplines. A young sociologist named Nathan Palmer, in a piece linked below, did a good job summarizing these basic questions asked by sociologists, so I'll steal his work. I'm sure he won't mind. First, Palmer asks, how is the phenomenon affected by how society is structured? I like to look at things in terms of rules of interaction. So to translate Palmer's question, what are the rules and what are the rules intended to do? So when we look at violent video games, who plays? Why? What social structures must be in place to play? Electricity, having access to the internet, having leisure time. How are things like status determined? How do we know a good video game from a bad one? How is this influenced by capitalism, militarism, individualism, or any other ism? Next, the sociologist looks at how is what is happening today a result of or response to what happened in the past. In other words, where do the rules come from and why? History was always my first love, and there's a clear historical component in sociology that I revel in. Mills identifies sociology as the intersection between biography and history, and that's what sold sociology to me many years ago. Whereas the historian wants to know about historical connections and processes, the sociologist is interested in the historical components of the lived experience. After all, real people built the pyramids, fought the wars, raised the food, go to work every day, and actually create the history that we see and experience and study in the history books. So how did these processes shape our lived experiences today? The sociologist is also very interested in what categories of people dominate in society. In other words, who makes the rules and who must obey? How are these rules enforced and toward what end? I would also add that many sociologists are interested in how these rules are challenged and resisted. Who are the dissenters, the dissidents, the deviants, and what happens to them when they step out of line? And what do they reveal about the larger society? Finally, Palmer asks, how could things be different? In other words, how are the rules changing and how can they be changed? By emphasizing change, however, Palmer is adding a layer of complexity to the analysis, one that could be problematic to the sociologist. For if things can be different, that means they could be better or they could be worse. So then I have to ask, what is the role of the sociologist in this process? Should the sociologist be nothing more than an objective observer, gathering information for others to contend with, maintaining his objectivity? Or should the sociologist be an active participant in helping things get better, which may bias his actual observations? There are arguments to be made on both sides, but we'll get into that later on. But I have to add a question to Palmer's list. The key question the sociologist must ask is, how do I know? In other words, what are the rules for understanding the rules? Mind-blowing. How do I know that my analysis is valid? In other words, am I describing something that is real rather than passing on my own common sense notions as true? It may seem common sense that violent video games would cause teenagers to become more violent, but the data doesn't support that, so the observation is invalid. And how do I know that my observations are reliable? In other words, when other people do these observations, are they going to see the same thing that I see? Validity and reliability are components of scientific questioning, and that's what pushes sociology into a claim that it is a science. Throughout this course, we'll be asking ourselves these questions and examining different phenomena using established sociological methods. The insights we get will be revealing. Let's give the final words to my friend C. Wright Mills. The first fruit of this imagination is the ideal that the individual can understand his own experience and gauge his own fate only by locating himself within his period, that he can know his own chances in life only by becoming aware of those of all individuals in his circumstances. In many ways, it is a terrible lesson. In many ways, a magnificent one. See you next time.